Chapter 14. Ground rent. Agrarian relations under capitalism. The capitalist system of farming and private property in land capitalism dominates agriculture in bourgeois countries. Large landowners concentrate land ownership, and capitalist enterprises with wage labor drive agricultural production. Small peasant holdings persist. Despite capitalist dominance, small-scale farming remains numerically significant. Two paths of capitalist development in agriculture: preservation of landlord estates. Feudal estates transition to capitalist economies, often retaining exploitative practices like labor rent and sharecropping, e.g., Germany, Russia, Italy, Japan. Breakdown of landlord estates. Bourgeois revolutions dismantle feudal land ownership, leading to faster development of productive forces and the rise of small peasant economies alongside bourgeois land ownership, e.g., France, USA. Land concentration intensifies. Land ownership increasingly concentrates in the hands of banks, bourgeoisie, and moneylenders, displacing both large feudal and small peasant ownership. Examples of land concentration. Statistics from the USA, Great Britain, and France illustrate the stark disparity in land ownership, with a small percentage of farms holding the majority of land. Monopoly of land ownership. Large landowners lease land to capitalist tenant farmers and small peasants, separating land ownership from production. Capitalist ground rent. Tenant farmers pay landowners rent, primarily ground rent, for the use of land. Rent also includes interest on invested capital and may be partially subsidized by lowering worker wages. Ground rent as surplus value. Ground rent represents the portion of surplus value created by wage workers that goes to the landowner after the tenant farmer deducts average profit. Differential rent profit motive drives agricultural investment. Capitalists invest in agriculture only if they expect to achieve at least the average profit for their industry. Additional profit in agriculture. More fertile land or better located farms yield higher profits due to lower production costs. Monopoly of land ownership. Limited land availability and private ownership create a monopoly, allowing landowners to extract surplus profit as rent. Price of production. Unlike in industry, where average conditions determine prices, agricultural prices are set by the production costs on the worst land, ensuring even those farms achieve average profit. Differential rent arises from differences in land fertility and location. Farms with more fertile land or better locations have lower production costs and thus higher profits, the excess of which is differential rent source of differential rent. While fertile land contributes to higher productivity, differential rent ultimately stems from the surplus value created by agricultural workers' labor. Differential rent, too, generated by additional investments in the same land, such as improved technology or fertilizers, leading to increased yields and higher profits. Landlords and tenant farmers. Landlords capture increasing profits from tenants through short-term leases, discouraging long-term investments by tenant farmers. Capitalist intensification and its consequences. The drive for maximum profit leads to exploitative farming practices, soil degradation, and hinders sustainable agriculture. Rejection of law of diminishing returns. This bourgeois theory, which claims agricultural output inevitably decreases with increased labor, is refuted. Technological advancements can increase productivity, but capitalist ownership structures hinder progress and access to food. Absolute rent. Price of land. Absolute rent. In addition to differential rent, landowners receive absolute rent even on the least productive land. This is due to the monopoly of private land ownership. Source of absolute rent. Agriculture has a lower organic composition of capital, less constant capital relative to variable capital, compared to industry. This leads to a higher rate of surplus value in agriculture. Absolute rent arises from the difference between the value of agricultural products, which includes this higher surplus value, and their price of production, which is based on the average profit rate across all industries. Private ownership restricts competition. Without private land ownership, capital would flow more freely into agriculture, equalizing profit rates and eliminating absolute rent. But the monopoly on land prevents this. Monopoly rent. A third type of rent arising from limited supply of specific agricultural products or resources, e.g., rare fruits, irrigation water. This allows producers to charge monopoly prices, exceeding the value of the product and generating monopoly rent. Social consequences of rent: landowners, without contributing to production, appropriate surplus value as rent. Absolute and monopoly rent increase food and raw material prices. Differential rent deprives society of the benefits of higher productivity on fertile lands. Capitalized rent: the price of land is determined by the rent it generates, capitalized at the prevailing interest rate. This means higher rent and lower interest rates lead to higher land prices. Rising land prices: land prices increase under capitalism due to both increasing rent and falling interest rates. Rent in the extractive industries: rent on building lots. Ground rent extends beyond agriculture. Landowners also receive ground rent from land used for resource extraction, mining, oil, and urban development. Rent in extractive industries: similar to agriculture, differential rent arises due to variations in resource quality, deposit depth, and distance to markets. Absolute rent is also present due to the lower organic composition of capital in extractive industries. Monopoly rent can arise from rare minerals sold at above-value prices. Consequences of rent in extractive industries: private land ownership hinders efficient resource extraction, leading to disjointed operations, obstructing mechanization, and increasing production costs. Rent for building lots: urban landowners receive rent from businesses and individuals leasing land for construction. Differential rent is heavily influenced by location, with higher rent charged for sites closer to city centers and industrial areas. This contributes to dense urban development and high housing costs. Monopoly rent in urban areas: limited land availability in cities allows landowners to charge monopoly rent, further inflating housing costs and contributing to overcrowding and slums. Impact on industry: ground rent adds to the costs of industrial production, as capitalists must purchase or lease land for their enterprises. High proportion of urban rent: in Britain, urban land rent constituted a significant portion of the total rent received by landlords. Rapid growth of urban land prices: increasing demand for limited urban land drives up prices. Large-scale and small-scale production in agriculture. Economic laws apply universally. The same capitalist development trends observed in industry also affect agriculture, leading to concentrated production and heightened class conflict. Stability of small peasant economy myth: this theory, propagated by capitalism's defenders, falsely claims small farms can compete with large-scale agriculture. Advantages of large-scale agriculture: large farms benefit from advanced machinery, increased labor productivity through technology inaccessible to small farmers. Cooperation and division of labor, improved efficiency and output. Market dominance: large farms produce the majority of marketed agricultural output, while small farms often struggle with subsistence farming. Limitations of small-scale farming: small farms inherently lack the capacity for large-scale production, technological advancement, and efficient resource utilization. Persistence of small farms: despite the advantages of large farms, small holdings persist because capitalists benefit from a pool of exploitable labor. Differentiation and ruin of the peasantry: the growth of large-scale agriculture leads to increased disparity among peasants, with many small and medium farms facing poverty and ruin. Mortgage credit and land expropriation: banks use mortgage loans to gain control of land, effectively transforming farmers into tenant farmers or wage laborers. High interest rates and the risk of foreclosure contribute to the ruin of small farmers. Tenancy and sharecropping: many small farmers are forced to lease land on unfavorable terms, often paying exorbitant rent or a share of their crops. This perpetuates a system of exploitation reminiscent of feudalism. Prevalence of tenancy and sharecropping: statistics from the USA and France illustrate the widespread reliance on tenancy and sharecropping, highlighting the vulnerability and dependence of small farmers. Deepening of the antithesis between town and country: agriculture lags behind industry. A defining characteristic of capitalism is the stark contrast between industrial and agricultural development, with agriculture lagging significantly. This disparity contributes to economic imbalances, crises, and high living costs. Technological disparity: technological advancements are slower to penetrate agriculture compared to industry. Machinery is primarily utilized on large capitalist farms, while small peasant producers lack access, further exacerbating their exploitation and ruin. Cheap labor hinders mechanization. The abundance of cheap labor in rural areas due to overpopulation discourages widespread adoption of machinery in agriculture. Cultural divide. Capitalism widens the gap between urban and rural areas in terms of cultural development. Cities, with their concentration of educational institutions, cultural venues, and scientific advancements, primarily serve the exploiting classes, leaving the rural population and urban proletariat largely excluded from cultural progress. Exploitation of the countryside. The economic root of the urban-rural divide lies in the exploitation of the countryside by urban centers. This exploitation takes various forms. Unfavorable terms of trade. Industrial bourgeoisie and merchants profit from high prices for manufactured goods and low prices for agricultural products. Exploitative credit. Banks and moneylenders impose harsh credit terms on rural populations. Taxation. The bourgeois state extracts taxes from the countryside. Resource drain. Rent payments and interest on loans transfer wealth from rural areas to urban centers, fueling the parasitic consumption of the exploiting classes. Private ownership of land and nationalization of the land ownership becomes increasingly parasitic. As capitalism evolves, private land ownership increasingly functions as a mechanism for extracting wealth from agriculture without contributing to production. Landowners gain substantial unearned income through ground rent and land sales, hindering agricultural development and increasing food prices. Nationalization as a solution. Marx advocated for land nationalization, transferring land ownership to the state, to address the parasitic nature of private land ownership. Lenin's perspective on land nationalization. Lenin distinguished between two types of land monopolies. Monopoly of private ownership. This creates absolute rent. Monopoly of land as a subject of economic activity. This creates differential rent. Nationalizing land would abolish the first monopoly and thus absolute rent, lowering agricultural prices. However, differential rent would persist. Benefits and limitations of land nationalization under capitalism. Nationalizing land under capitalism could remove obstacles to agricultural development posed by private ownership. Free the peasantry from remnants of feudalism. Strengthen the alliance between the proletariat and peasantry against the bourgeoisie. Challenges to land nationalization in developed capitalism. The bourgeoisie resists land nationalization, fearing it could threaten private property in general. Capitalists increasingly own land, aligning their interests with those of traditional landowners. Impoverishment of the peasantry. Capitalism inevitably leads to the exploitation and impoverishment of the peasantry, driving them towards an alliance with the proletariat in the struggle against the capitalist system.